Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video, we're going to build the Italeri 1/72 scale G2 Cannonvogel Stuka, so the Ju-87 with the famous anti-tank cannons on the underside. So I've previously done an inbox review of this kit and compared it to the Academy 1/72 scale Stukas, so if you haven't seen that, go check it out. I'll be doing building in this video, and in two future videos we'll cover painting and weathering, and in the last video I'll also do a little final review and summary of what I think of this kit after having built it. So, without further ado, let's get into building. After giving the 2 grey sprues and the 1 clear sprue a wash in some warm soapy water to remove the residue and help the paint and glue conform to the model, I begin to cut out the cockpit parts using my side cutters. I keep a little bit of sprue attached to the instrument panel so I have a handle to hold on to when painting it, and then I move on to cleaning up the interior parts. There was a fair bit of flashing and some nasty ejector pin markings in some very visible spots which had to be removed using a file and a knife before I began to glue some of the cockpit parts together, such as the seats and the joystick for the pilot. Despite the heavy cleanup required, the parts for the interior are quite nice for the cockpit floor and the seats. Moving on to the cockpit sidewalls, as I mentioned in my review, there was no interior detailing on them whatsoever. So I decided to add a little bit since a lot of the cockpit can be visible with the large windows on the Stuka. I use a little bit of Tamiya 1mm masking tape to add some ribbing by placing some running along the length of the fuselage and a couple running vertical based on a couple of reference photos I had. It's not a massive amount of detail, but it will add just a little bit that can be visible. In some areas I use some slightly thicker 3mm tape for some of the thicker ribbing, and once I'm happy with that, I then cut out some pieces of polystyrene and use a bit of scrap sprue to create some extra details on the sidewall, such as the throttles, equipment storages, and the circuit breaker board to the right of the pilot. I glue the polystyrene and sprue parts into place using the usual modelling glue, and I also use a small needle to poke a couple of holes to add some rivet detailing for the ribbing, and also to add the circuit breaker parts. Following this, the cockpit interior, sidewalls, the instrument panel, the rear bulkhead with the radios, and the floor of the cockpit all received 2 coats of Tamiya XF24 dark grey, applied using a little bit of water to thin the paint to keep the layers nice and thin so that all the details will be visible underneath. Once the second coat of XF24 has dried for the entire cockpit, I then move on to painting the finer details. I use a very fine brush and some Vallejo flat black to paint the throttle quadrant and some of the instrument panels on the sides that I've added, including the fuse switches and also the radio stack for the rear gunner. I also take advantage of the raised details on the instrument panel and paint some of the sections and the instrument dials where they're raised flat black. I also paint the gun sight, and then after that's dried, go over the instrument dials with some X1 Tamiya gloss black to help make them a little bit more shiny like they would be in the real aircraft because of the glass. Next I use some Vallejo flat white to paint the switches for the fuse box, to paint the raised details on the radio stack, and also to dab a little bit of onto the gauges to add some extra detailing to them. For some of the switches in the cockpit that are raised, I use some Vallejo flat yellow and also some vermilion red to paint them based on the reference photos that I have. These are mainly for the bomb switches and some of the engine controls. I use some Tamiya XF64 red brown to paint the seat cushions, the handle on the joystick, some of the side details on the cockpit, and also the gun sight's cushion. I paint the rudder pedals XF16 flat aluminium and also dry brush a little bit of it onto the ribbing and some of the exposed corners and edges in the cockpit to add a little bit of metal chipping. The raised details for the seatbelt for the pilot were then painted XF52 flat earth before the cockpit received a nice thick wash of some Tamiya black panel liner scent. And once the panel liner had dried, I then glued the floor of the cockpit to the sidewalls, and then I could glue the 2 fuselage halves together. As you can see, a little bit of scratch building can really go a long way with improving models that have basic sidewall details, although at least for this kit the cockpit floor and the seats and also the panels are really quite nicely done. The fuselage halves were then glued together and held in place while they dried with a little bit of masking tape and a bulldog clip. Overall they fitted together pretty nicely, although the front section didn't quite fully seal together after I'd removed the masking tape, so I added a little bit of extra glue and then left it aside with a bulldog clip for just a little bit longer. While it dried, I then started to assemble the front engine cowling. I cut the parts out using my usual routine and then sanded them down, and then glued the radiator detailing in first, and the small pin that's used to hold the propeller in place, before then gluing the other section of the cowling. I then glued the propeller and its spinner cover onto the hub that holds it into place on the cowling, before turning my attention back to the fuselage and adding on the elevators and the struts that are used to hold them up. Both these parts were glued to the fuselage, and the fit for them was pretty much excellent. There's some very nice guide pins as well, and it was easy to line up the strut once the elevator had been put on first. I then cut out the wing halves, and after giving them a fair bit of sanding to remove some of the flash on them, and using a needle to poke out the holes required for the guns, the landing gear and the radiator, I cut out the upper sections of the wings and then glued them together, and then used a little bit of masking tape to hold the halves together. There are no guide pins on the wings, however it's relatively easy to line them up, and the fit on them was okay. The lower wings, however, required a fair bit of cleanup because of the decision to have them flaps moulded into the aircraft's wing. Usually other manufacturers have them as separate pieces, which means that the Italeri wings are a little bit tougher, however some of the detail is a little bit hidden. I left the wing halves to dry with a bit of masking tape to hold them in place, and glued the engine cowling on, before then gluing the wing halves to the bottom of the fuselage. The fit on them was alright. It was definitely better after I added the small extra section that was missing, and while it was drying I glued the radiators together and then glued them to the wings. Next I cut out and assembled the parts for the landing gear before gluing them to the bottom of the wings. Interestingly, the landing gear in this kit was the version where the fairing has been removed from the landing gear, which was done later in the war to help prevent mud and snow from clogging up the landing gear. It looks a little bit unusual and maybe not as iconic as the Stuka with the fairing over the wheels, but I thought it looked pretty nice and it was cool to have something a bit unique. I added some of the finer parts for the elevator and also the step for the rear gunner and pilot to get up onto the wing, before then finally assembling the distinct anti-tank cannons for the G variant. The cannons have a little bit of detailing on them and they're pretty easy to assemble. They include the ammunition and also an extra little piece for the end of the barrel for the muzzle brake. Unfortunately, on one side of the wings, the peg I drilled out using the needle for one of the pins for the cannon was a little bit too small, so I had to cut the pin off the cannon and then just line it up and glue it into place by eye. Next I got out some Vallejo water-based putty, and I used a cocktail stick to apply it into some of the areas where there were gaps along seam lines to help fill them in. I applied it using the cocktail stick and smooth it down with my fingers. Since it's water-based putty, it's pretty easy to wash out of the gaps of your fingers. You can also use a little bit of water to help it run into the gaps on the aircraft fuselage a little bit more easily. While it was drying, I used a bit of Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue to glue the clear parts to the fuselage. I decided, however, to leave the cockpit section for the pilot unglued so that I could open and close the canopy. Once the Vallejo putty had been left for 24 hours, I sanded it down so it was nice and smooth using some very fine sandpaper, and after rescoring some of the panel lines, the model was ready for some painting, which is what we'll be covering in the next video. So thank you very much for watching this one. I do hope you really enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like, and feel free to leave any suggestions or other quips in the comment section down below. And a big shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons, and a special welcome to a new member, CB314, aka Carl. So welcome on board to the Sprues Enterprise, Carl. Very, very grateful to have you on board. Anyways, thanks again, and until the next video, model on.